Well, it's terrific to be with you this morning. I see a lot of friendly faces and old friends in the audience, and so it's especially good for me to be here with you. I'm John Allen, General John Allen, and with my old friend and colleague here at Brookings, Mike O'Hanlon, we direct the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence. And we welcome you this morning. We welcome you today to the 7th Annual Military Fellows Research Symposium of the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence. And what you'll see and you'll hear today is a product of the Fellows' research and their organization of this event. Now, the agenda for today's symposium features a rich compendium of the scholarship and the independent research of the Fellows of think tanks and universities from across the country. And I think you'll be deeply impressed with the quality of that research and the work expressed in the panels today, which you'll hear throughout the agenda, on some very important subjects and topics. I want to speak to the fellows this morning specifically, to offer a bit of context as you gather today and as you consider some of the most important issues of our time. Now, it was my great honor to serve twice as a fellow. My first tour was as the Marine Corps Fellow to the Center for Strategic and International Studies immediately after the American Civil War. Needless to say, a long time ago, in 1984. The program and the entire concept of the fellowship was very new to the Marine Corps and more broadly to the services at the time, and I had the incredible opportunity to find myself as a captain in the Marine Corps, serving alongside 3 other service fellows with 20 years experience on me across the board. Now, I remember how old those lieutenant colonels and commanders looked to me. At the time, frankly, they looked so old, I didn't know they had much life left in them. Now today, wiser, older, I look back on those lieutenant colonels and commanders and colonels and captains, and I remember them as young, athletic, ruggedly handsome, and incredibly brilliant officers. But I know you are spending, as fellows, and I spent an incredible year learning at the feet of the masters from all over this town. And my research concentration fell into 2 principal areas. The first was an area called in those days low intensity conflict, or LIC. The Marine Corps chartered me to study and to write on this topic to help the Corps to determine its service priorities regarding this and other joint concepts that were emerging at the time. Also at the time, CSIS required all of its fellows to be involved in one of the major study projects that was underway. And I found myself in the strategic mobility study, where I spent the better part of the year studying the realities, the emerging realities of strategic airlift. And the 50-page paper that I wrote and presented at several conferences and ultimately to the Secretary of the Air Force was a comparative analysis on the nation's next strategic airlifter, the C-5B, or an airplane not yet off the drawing boards, a revolutionary aircraft called the C-17. As you might imagine, for the aerospace industry, the stakes were very high in the down select of that aircraft. And industry had been extremely cooperative with me, helping me to understand why their model was what the U.S. needed for its future airlifter. To have been a part of the reasoning and the rationale for the decision to buy the C-17 truly made my year as a fellow. In the many years since, I've thought back to that opportunity as my own aircraft taxied past this great airplane on innumerable runways around the world, and how honored I was to be part of that, something that could never have happened had I not been a fellow. My second fellowship was an internal fellowship in the Corps and was occurring during some of the most important years for our services and the Joint Force. In the aftermath of Desert Storm and with the apparent dissolution of the Soviet Union at the time, we were engaged in an intense struggle to right-size the Department of Defense and the services. While I was technically being carried on the rolls of the Marine Corps Command and Staff College, I was actually quietly seconded to the personal staff of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, where I and 6 other officers labored around the clock in shifts producing all manner of thought pieces and op-eds and individual research for the Commandant to make him more competitive in the tank with his fellow service chiefs, the Vice, and the Chairman, to be competitive in the conversations with the Secretary of the Navy and certainly the Secretary of Defense, but most importantly, again, being a Marine, being very competitive and very helpful to the Congress of the United States to understand the logic of the Marine Corps. I won't take you through all the details, but my time as a Marine Corps fellow, both outside and inside the Corps, shaped me profoundly and would equip me with critical intellectual skills that served me to the day I retired and beyond. Being a fellow, being in this environment taught me one of the most important demands of being a strategic leader, that strategic leaders must be able to sense and to understand the strategic environment in which they exist. This reality is not only an imperative, it not only shaped my command style in expeditionary units, it provided me an immediate capacity to be relevant as a general officer years later, whether that was in East Asia during the South Asia tsunami, or with the emergence of an increasingly activist China, or dealing with the tribes in the Al-Anbar province of Iraq, or with President Karzai in the palace in Kabul, or organizing the global coalition to counter ISIL. I promise you that the thought processes that I developed as a fellow on the issues of strategic relevance were fundamental to my career. I also learned another critical skill from my fellowship period. Organizational structures matter enormously, and how an organization or a commander structures itself for mission accomplishment tells you a great deal about that organization and how it organizes to accomplish its mission, but also how it senses the environment in which it must work. And I can trace this back to a conversation I had with other senior fellows one evening while I was at CSIS, and to a comment that went something like, quote, "You can tell a lot about a commander by how that officer organizes for combat," unquote. That conversation went on to discuss relevance versus irrelevance, both by how one understood the environment and how the organization was shaped and reshaped to be relevant to mission accomplishment all the way to and including the grand strategic level. Now, subsequently and for the rest of my career, within hours of my assuming my leadership role, whatever that might have been, I would meet with my leadership and teach what I believed to be the realities of the tactical or the operational or the strategic environment. And then I would discuss what I believed to be the imperatives for mission execution and achieving the strategy. And that went on as late as when I took command in Afghanistan. Within an hour of that change of command, all of my commanders, 3 stars, 2 stars, 1 stars, were in the room, and we did not come out of that room until we were of one mind, understanding the operational environment and ensuring that we were properly organized to accomplish the strategy. I offer these views because I believe you, the fellows, are in one of the most important moments of your lives, a fellowship, the opportunity for unconstrained thought and intellectual exploration. And I hope you're grasping it. Today's the 7th annual symposium. If we think back to the first symposium, what's changed about the strategic environment that we must understand? 7 years ago, we were in active combat operations in 2 theaters. The Arab Spring had not occurred. There was no civil war in Syria, and Europe had yet to be flooded with what will be likely millions of refugees. The Ukraine was still intact, and NATO was wondering what comes next after Afghanistan. The South China Sea was a set of conflicting maritime claims, and the emerging Chinese military bastion on Woody Island was on no one's screen. No one had heard of gray zone operations. The climate was cooler then. Ebola was a health aberration, and the Zika virus didn't hold the potential for the ruin of an entire Olympics and a nation's economy along with it. So fellows, in the period of your symposia, just 7 years, the strategic environment has changed profoundly. In fact, the changes have been breathtaking because of who you are and the potential for strategic leadership both within the services and your own agencies, the United States is going to rely on you for insights and leadership that few others will be equipped to deliver. Today's symposium is a waypoint in your learning. But I call on each of you, I call on all of you, to embrace the reality of what this program means and what it is and what it can deliver. So I'll see you later today in the agenda, where I'll have the opportunity and the honor to interview one of America's greatest leaders and thinkers, Michel Flournoy, on some of the great challenges that we face as a nation and as a people. And I wish you a very successful symposium. Thank you very much. We've got a couple of minutes. If anyone would like to pose any questions early along to get the exploratory juices flowing, and then we'll take a brief coffee break just to recharge, and then get on with the first panel. So any questions? This is that difficult moment that occurs. Yes, sir. Good to see you. How are you? Well, I wasn't there. I don't have the context for the question. If he's talking about a serving officer, all serving officers have an inherent responsibility to examine the orders that they receive to ensure that they're legal orders. And if you ever believe, and all officers have a responsibility to give their best military advice to their commanders, and that's all the way from second lieutenant to the company commander to four-star general to the President of the United States. Giving good, best military advice is inherent to who you are and commanding within the rule of law, and in our case, in the United States, commanding within the system of justice called the Constitution. If you believe you've been given an unlawful order, you have a moral and a legal responsibility to express your concerns about it and to disobey it if you're presented with that. And that shouldn't be a moral quandary. Now, you may have a different view on what that order is, and not you personally. One may have a different view on what that order is, and that's why you have a responsibility to take it to your commander or to the secretary or to the president, in which case then the conversation begins about why the perspectives are different, and in fact you could be convinced that it is a legal order. But if you have a sense that the order you've been given is an illegal order, you have a moral responsibility and a legal responsibility not to obey that order. But you can't do it without expressing your concerns to your leaders. Yes, sir. Anything else? I'm standing between you and the first cup of coffee, I think. Yes, sir, in the back, please.
Thank you, sir. Thomas Labouche, French liaison officer at the Pentagon. Just a question. During the last decade, when the US were confronted with numerous insurgencies and numerous challenges, it was very trendy to speak about thinking out of the box. What is your understanding and your definition of this concept today?
Well, my guess would be that in France it's probably the same, and that is we value innovative thinkers. There's a difference between thinking out of the box and acting out of the box. And there's no real reason why you shouldn't be able to do both given the right kind of operational environment. You know, one of the things I didn't say in these remarks that were I to have a little bit longer time to craft them, one of the other points, taking it to 3 points that I learned, was the inherent responsibility of all officers to be responsible for their professional military education. That goes to the point of being both a leader and a teacher and a scholar of the profession of arms. And if you are not all three of those, it's very difficult for you to think out of the box. In other words, to think about alternative mechanisms or means or ways to accomplish the mission. And we want that in our officers, all the way from second lieutenant or ensign to the most senior officers that we have. And my guess is that given how France has done militarily, it is inherent in who you are as well, because in many respects the United States has reflected the French military culture for many, many years, and we gained, I think, many of our best attributes from you. But an officer must be, I think, committed and biased towards his or her self-education. that gives you the capacity to be innovative. And on the battlefield, we want officers to take initiative, whether that's, again, a platoon leader or a MEF commander or the commander of a field army. We expect them to be able to take initiative, but you take that within the framework of what we call the commander's intent. So you're not confined by a very narrow set of strictures and regulations. You're confined by the intellectual right and left limits of your commander, who has given you the latitude in an environment that he or she has personally created, given you the latitude to think out of the box, to express yourself on those issues, and to act if necessary. I think it's absolutely imperative. Yes, sir. Ray.
General, you've spoken about Boston, etc. How would you evaluate or compare that experience with officers who go to JPM2
Right.
senior class war colleges, or thirdly, perhaps civilian university?
It goes in some measure to the response I just made, and that is if an officer, a leader, relies solely on the institution itself to provide for the education and therefore or thereafter the relevance of that officer, you're generally going to be found wanting. And I had the benefit of both going to fellowships but also going to the National War College. And what I found was if the program is done, having done both, and also having gotten a master's degree, so I did all three of those, so I think I can speak comparatively. What you have to do is to recognize the timing within your career in order to do those things, so that you don't, first and foremost, walk on the time that you would have to command. Command is just about the most important thing that you'll do within the service. So between the periods of time when you'll be sent to a fellowship or to school or off to a master's degree, you have to preserve that time. You have to have time in the operating forces as a leader, and you have to preserve the time for command. It doesn't mean you have to be a careerist. I don't propose that at all. But timing matters, and when you do it as a portion of the time of your career, it also matters. Now, the curriculum that I had at the War College actually was virtually identical to the curriculum that I had as a student at Georgetown University in the Security Studies program. The two were very comparable in many respects. With the program that I had as a fellow, because the Marine Corps required me not only to write a project for them, but also to be involved with a project at CSIS, I was also given, if you will, a shadow curriculum for me to study while I was there that helped me to remain abreast of what my peers were doing at the time in the Command and Staff College. So it's a service choice. It's a service, the implications of that choice have implications for the service. And I want to be careful about saying that if you went to a fellowship and you didn't go to the War College, you're disadvantaged in some form or another. In the Marine Corps, and I think I speak for the other services in this, we choose some of our most competitive officers to go on fellowships because the sense is that their own professional development, their own professional capabilities are sufficiently to the point where they can go out and be left on independent studies apart from the structured program within a war college, and they'll come out of it just as well prepared for senior responsibility in the service as if they had sat in a classroom for 9 months in an academic curriculum. I think it is a conscious choice that fits the service, it fits the needs of the officer, and it fits the sense by that service of that officer's potential long-term leadership in the school. Does that help, Ray?
Well, you drew the distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And your between the two. Recommend to a young officer.
They try to do both. And you do it in the right sequence. got my master's from Georgetown as a captain. I went to the National War College as a lieutenant colonel. And it's possible to do both, but you have to be thinking in terms of the waypoints within your career. And you got to be I want to be sure that I'm clear on this. I never intended that I would hit those waypoints, but what I did intend to do was to do what I could to preserve the space for schooling in my career, so that as that space began to appear on the horizon for me as time passed, I would either be in a school environment, or I'd be in a fellowship environment, or I'd be in a civilian institution or a comparable military master's degree level program studying. The idea is operational study, operational professional development, and command. And it's a combination of those that I think you have to constantly be thinking about in order to structure the timeline of your career. Some services spend a great deal of time managing that for you. In the Marine Corps at that time, nobody managed it for me. You know, their sense at the time in the early 80s was your master's degree ought to be spent in the FMF, in the Fleet Marine Force, leading Marines. That's not a bad option, and command was a wonderful thing, but we pretty quick ran out of juice when we were competing against the other services at very senior levels where those officers had spent years being developed in professional military education, and we embraced it ourselves as time went on. Good question, though, Ray. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Veronica Cartier, you have mentioned about strategic environment. As our environment is keep changing, would you please elaborate tactical military intelligence environment, which is very complex, and that is very crucial for preparation for intelligent judgment and operational decisions. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, it's a full-time job of our Director of National Intelligence and the various intelligence agencies within the U.S. government to constantly examine the nature of the operational environment to ensure that our collection platforms, our collection methods, our processes for collection analysis, and very importantly, the means by which we express the results of all of that is both timely and relevant to decision makers. And just as an example, from my time as a lieutenant colonel, as what we call a battalion landing team commander, to my time on the ground in Iraq, to my time in leading the NATO forces on the ground in Afghanistan, that's a sweep of about 20 years. And the dimension of the environment that may have changed the greatest for us in that period of time was the issue of the cyber environment. It both created enormous capabilities for me as a commander, but enormous vulnerabilities for me as a commander. And the work of the intelligence community to both be able to understand the vulnerabilities that are offered by our opponents, by how they talk, when they talk, the mechanisms over which they talk, the nature of the encryption, et cetera, but also the ways in which we can defend ourselves, computer network defense and so on. That is, I think, one of the most revolutionary changes in the world I lived in, beyond just simple changes in platform improvement for command and control. So this was, a constant effort on the part of our intelligence community broadly to understand the whole world associated with the cyber environment so that we could both exploit it for our own purposes and protect ourselves within that environment, because absent that commitment, we would be hugely vulnerable right now. And it was very helpful to me as time went on, and the intelligence community helped me to understand what was happening in the cyber environment as I worked in the physical environment. Thank you. Okay, I think we're at a point where we can break briefly and get some coffee and then convene for the first panel. Yeah. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great day.
We can get panel one to the riser, and ladies and gentlemen, feel free to refill your coffee.
I should sit at one of the ends. Yeah, I guess I'll sit at this end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. Good, good. Thank you.
How are you? Good to see you. Where do you go after?
Still don't know. I think
Thank you.
I'm interviewing for various positions. I'm hoping to stay in the area. My wife is kind of transferring her business interests here.
What sort of businesses?
She's a program manager. Right now she works for the state of Washington. She does scheduling for.
I have
I don't know if you know the Seattle
a
area.
couple like this.
Yeah.
Bridge across Lake Washington, the floating bridge across
Oh, yeah.
Hood Canal. She was in the scheduling for that for years, and did it, remotely. Did it from Germany. But it's time to get to the East Coast.
Oh, good. Where did you grow up?
Army back.
Right.
Speaking to the top.
So here, give people a couple of minutes to get in. Happy Super Tuesday, everybody. I've got to say, I'm E.J. Dion. I'm a senior fellow here at Brookings, and I have to say it's a real honor to get to moderate this panel. It seems like a perfect way to begin Super Tuesday to talk about the men and women in our armed forces and their importance to our security. During political campaigns, you hear politicians talk a lot about the great men and women of our armed forces, and it's said so often that we forget that it's actually true. For myself, my experiences come from my sister, who is a retired Navy and Navy Reserve captain who is in the JAG Corps, from our extraordinary, here at Brookings, Federal Executive Fellows Program, and I've also gotten to teach a lot of Army captains and majors at Georgetown. And I can tell you that all that campaign rhetoric is not empty. And I think it's appropriate that we begin not with technology, not with all the things that fascinate us about what the military can do, but about the people of our military today. And so this panel on the future of the all-volunteer force is about those people. It's also about, and Colonel Huggins will speak about this, the issues about whether we have separated civilian and military life so much that we don't have the kind of contact you need in a democratic society, whether we're leaning on such a small proportion of our population to defend us, and also how we strengthen our military and strengthen the training that our military leaders have. You have bios for everybody. I just want to pick up a couple of facts about them for you. Colonel Barry Huggins, who'll speak first, is a Federal Executive Fellow here at Brookings. He's an infantry officer with over 30 years of active service. He commanded military units in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He's a graduate of North Carolina State. Basketball fans take note. He holds a master's degrees in Russian studies from Harvard and in national resource strategy at the National Defense University. Lieutenant Commander Katie Jacobson is a Federal Executive Fellow at the RAND Corporation. She's in the Navy. Incidentally, this is a very Army-heavy panel, so if in honor of my sister I show a bias toward the Navy, please forgive me, all of you. She is an 11-year veteran of the Navy. She joined the Navy because of her time in the Sea Scouts, and she graduated from Tulane's Navy Reserve Officer Training Corps program in New Orleans, and she didn't want me to say this, but I want to say this. She was ranked #1 amongst all NROTC surface warfare ensigns. She has also been assigned to the Defense Department Why We Serve program, speaking to groups around the country. And by the way, she could beat any of you in sailing matches. Is a great racer as well. Colonel Valerie Keaveney is a CSA Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security. He is in the Army. He is an infantry officer. And listen to this, he earned the Combat Infantryman's Badge, the Expert Infantryman's Badge, the Master Parachutist Badge, the Pathfinder Badge, the Air Assault Badge, and the Ranger Tab. So we feel very well protected here on this panel today. And lastly, Lieutenant Colonel Victor Sundquist, Army Reserve Fellow at Georgetown's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. He is currently attending as a fellow of that program, and he has worked as an intelligence officer at all levels of command and is currently working as an Army strategist. He therefore knows in advance every question I'm going to ask and every answer that will be given by members of this panel. Colonel Huggins, I'm going to start with you, and you want to talk about preserving the all-volunteer force. When the draft ended, and I alluded to this earlier, the old ideal of military service as a common obligation of citizenship was replaced by this new model of voluntary professional force. And you've observed that as the force becomes more insular, more concentrated, and less connected to society at large, especially to elites, it begins to take on the characteristics of a special interest group. It is bold, but I think accurate of you to say that, and I'd like you to talk about that to kick off this panel.
Thank you, EJ, very much. Sam Adams said in 1776, or wrote, a standing army, however necessary it may be at some times, is always dangerous to the liberties of the people, because soldiers are apt to consider themselves as a body distinct from the rest of the citizens. Now, I don't know if we're there, but I do sense a split. Let me give you some context. I am the son of a command sergeant major. I married a woman who is the daughter of a sergeant major. We married as lieutenants while we served together in Germany. I had two brothers, both of whom served. She has a brother who served in the Coast Guard. And so, to some extent, when we talk about a military-civilian divide, I view it from a very clear perspective. I am a sort of zoo animal looking through the bars at the rest of American society. And that colors my perspective. Question number one, is there really a split? I think the answer is yes, but it is not contrary to what some are predisposed to believe. It is not a split based on class. The American service member populace, the enlisted populace, it does not come predominantly from poor neighborhoods. Pretty well, I think, pretty well established that they come overrepresented from the top 3 quintiles in income distribution, and that's been a consistent trend really since the birth of the all-volunteer force. They are not undereducated, in part because of the standards that we hold enlistees to. Far more likely to have graduated high school. Officers are far more likely to have a bachelor's degree than the population at large. What they are, however, now is older and more married than the civilian population. That's counterintuitive. People think of soldiers as young, and it was true. In 1973, when the all-volunteer force began, about 64% of that demographic in the American public at large was married. The demographic in the military was about 40%. That is inverted, and the population in the military now tends to be married at a greater rate than society at large, 56% to about 43%. It is predominantly Southern. The only region of the country that overproduces military accessions is the South. About 40% of our force comes from that region, and you can argue about where precisely the boundaries are, but I think generally speaking, the South tends to overproduce soldiers. It tends to be more Republican and more conservative, not the same thing, but they tend to run together, and you'll find that 36% of post 9/11 veterans identify as Republicans, compared to about 23% of the public at large. And about 48% of veterans overall consider themselves conservative, compared to 37% of the public at large. And finally, maybe most significantly, it is insular. It is a family business to a large degree, and getting worse. Veterans with a child who have served, about 21%. The general public with a child who has served, about 9%. Veterans under age 40 with an immediate family member who has served, about 60%. The American public at large, about 39%. And those figures, that schism seems to be growing. That's the trend. Now, why does this schism exist? I think there's a couple of reasons. Number one, the percentage of the population that has served has been in a steady decline. This panel is not here to argue about the size of the force. Michael Hanlon and others have covered that topic well and what the arguments are for capacity and capability, but it is undeniably true that the number of, the percentage of the American public that has served has declined from about 1.5% in 1970, served actively at any one time, about 0.5% now. In 1970, about 13.8% of the population was a veteran. In 2010, that was cut in half to about 7%. That's a remarkable decline. The decline among elites is even more. In 1971, about 73% of Congress were veterans. And in 2011, that number was about 20%. That's a 70% decline over time. Another reason, in addition to a lower percentage of the population having direct experience, is that there are fewer willing and able recruits in the population at large. And in particular of concern is the capable recruits that are qualified. Right now, only about 17% of the 17 to 24-year-old age cohort would qualify and be available to serve. And if you rule out the bottom 30%, the Armed Forces Qualification Tests lowest categories, if you rule out those, only about 13% is even eligible to serve. When you marry that to propensity, when you marry that to an improving economic situation, the pool continues to get smaller. And the size of the pool, I think, directly correlates to the insularity of the pool. So the risks and opportunities presented by this, I think, are manifold. Number one, it tends to distort decision-making among the elites. A recent survey showed that about 60% of Americans support the idea of going to war against ISIS, sending ground troops, but only about 16% of those same respondents said that they would be willing to go themselves. And it has been argued, I think James Fallows said, war has become an action conducted on the periphery of public life. That is a sea change. It distorts decision-making because what has been called the unequal dialogue between civilian leadership and military leadership has become not just unequal, but really across a chasm, as there are fewer and fewer members of Congress and decision-makers that have actual service, military service, uniform service. The lack of understanding grows, and the opportunities to disconnect. It hands disproportionate power to those members of Congress who have served. It distorts the decision-making process not only about going to war, but about when and in what quantities, and it allows military leaders to go unchallenged in their recommendations. Now, I'm a proud member of the military. I'm a proud officer. I enlisted in 17. I've become an officer, and I'm quite happy with where I am. But I will tell you this, the Army, the services, have not bought the nation a strategic victory in decades. I don't know if there's a direct correlation between military leadership being unchallenged in its prescriptions and that lack of strategic success, but the correlation is certainly there, and that's an area for further research. Another potential problem is that the military, becomes a self-congratulatory caste. You will often hear, you can't be around the military very long without hearing the phrase, the 1%. That 1% who has carried the nation's burden. None of that, I think, is objectively true, and certainly have not carried the entire burden. There are good reasons, though, for that attitude to prevail. The question is, does it become self-fulfilling? Does it become a cast iron attitude where Sam Adams' fears come true? And finally, we get politicized. That lack of a personal connection, the aging of the force and the concentration of the force makes the relationship less paternal, I think, than it was at one point, and more transactional between the American public and its service members. It becomes politicized. You see the confirmation of 3- and 4-star generals. You see arguments over compensation, discussions about the draft, about the pace and type of social change that will take place among the population. These all become political issues, and I think more politicized than they would otherwise be. Finally, the question is, if the split is real and if it poses risks to us, what should we do about it? I think first and foremost, we've got to give the American people what they pay for. We have got to be ready and competent. That's a non-negotiable standard, and all the leaders agree with that. We have also, though, got to reestablish our ethical and professional standards. We have got to be above reproach to maintain a respect that transcends the political. The military continues to be, and has been since about 1987, the most respected institution among the American public, but that line is creeping downward. We've got to be apolitical, in my opinion. More Marshall, less Curtis LeMay, less MacArthur. You see retired generals routinely lining up to issue political endorsements. You see appearing on television shows and participating in punditry. These are things that tend to reinforce politicization of the service member caste, if you will. I think we've got to be judicious in leading and following social change. We've got to be in the right spot to maintain the support of the American people. And that's something I think Katie will talk about a little bit in her comments. And finally, we've got to put a face on the force. We've got to, through the reserve component and through the messaging, through emphasizing the social mobility that we can provide, through emphasizing, dispelling myths about the service that are born out of lack of familiarity with who we are and what we do. The myth of every man a victim, the myth of the prevalence of PTSD and so forth. And in fact, if you look at surveys, 98% of combat veterans say they were proud to have served, and about 86% said they appreciated life more. Post-traumatic growth is a reality, but it's not a message that we put out either. And so that sort of outreach with the right message and through the right channels to include the reserve component, I think can help to bridge this gap. And finally, serious consideration ought to be given to national service with a military component, not a draft necessarily, but some form of military national service that offers as an option for those who are qualified and wish to serve. Perhaps in exchange, some sort of grand bargain of student loans and other opportunities for advancement is something we ought to think about if it matters to us that our service members not become too distinct from American society at large.
Thank you so much for that very candid look, and I want to come back to national service because I think that's important. Also, I was thinking that the definition of a well-disciplined child is to be the son or daughter of a sergeant major. I want to know what that was like. Lieutenant Commander Jacobson has been involved in the Future of the Force effort, and the idea that what she would like to talk about is how the Navy's personnel system has largely remained unchanged for 6 decades. As she puts it, it's an industrial age model in a digital world. And beyond recruiting Northern Democrats, which is something that seems to come out of Colonel Huggins's presentation, could you talk about how sort of recruitment and also something we talked about before? I am very interested in sort of recruiting to government in general and how some of the issues you're grappling with in the Navy are also related to hiring in the government in general.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, good morning, and many thanks to Brookings for inviting me to be a panelist. This is my first experience as a panelist, so I appreciate that. I'm truly honored to be here. Sir, to answer your question, I'd like to frame my remarks around Secretary of Defense Ash Carter's Force of the Future initiatives. And I want to talk about why I think personnel reform, talking about that now, is very relevant and it's very timely. So when people ask me, about Force of the Future, the most common question I get is, well, what's wrong with our current personnel system now? And I think that's a very fair question. Retention numbers, we seem to be meeting the mark there. Our enlisted and junior officers are the most talented and educated as they've ever been. Our senior leaders appear very well suited for their positions. So what's the problem? And that's the hardest sell, because at the moment, there is no problem. But there are indications and warnings out there that highlight the fact that there are problems to come. So I'd like to give you a few examples. Center for Naval Analysis, they found that in a recent study that while today's recruiting environment is favorable to the military today, it warns that we must plan for a future in which that's no longer the case. Our personnel costs have increased despite a declining end strength. Relative to the civilian market, women are still underrepresented in the military. We're only at 15.1% for the active duty component. And I believe this is a Navy statistic, but Admiral Moran a few weeks ago said that 85% of new recruits are raised by parents with an active duty background. And so the question is that healthy? I'm not sure, but to Colonel Huggins' point, it kind of looks like almost a special interest group. Colonel Huggins also mentioned the 13% of our enlisted, of today's youth would even qualify for enlisted service. That's troubling. And then the last major reform to our officer personnel system was enacted in 1980, otherwise known as DOTMA, or the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act. And I ask, are the same objectives for officer management and the assumptions that underlie them, are they still valid? Are they still relevant today? So folks, what I would assert is that the nature of the game has changed since the Cold War. And I'm not just talking about our competition, but also our strategic environment. And the general spoke to this earlier, the rise of the global information system and the increasing rate of technology adoption and creation. So the bottom line is that Force the Future initiatives were designed with the mindset to maintain a competitive edge in our nation's battle for talent. We can't afford to be passive and expect that what worked in the past is going to work for us in the future. Force of the Future initiatives, they challenge the status quo. It's uncomfortable. And they challenge the long-held assumptions that what our military needs, they challenge our assumptions about what the military needs to not only remain relevant, but to be the best in the world. So I like to think of these initiatives as addressing two lines of effort, and that is quality of talent and quality of life. So I'd like to break those down. First, quality of talent. Last November, Secretary Carter, he announced a series of initiatives intended to improve the overall DoD talent pool. For example, he called for creating on-ramps for folks that are currently not within DoD but want to contribute. Specifically, these on-ramps look to hire talented civilians, innovators, entrepreneurs, top executives. He also called for off-ramps for folks currently in DoD that could pursue fellowship programs, sabbaticals, higher education. There was also some initiatives in there about the reserve component. The second line of effort addressed quality of life. In this past January, Secretary Carter announced a second series of initiatives to strengthen the support given to military families to improve their quality of life. So a few examples, these have been widely publicized about expanding the maternity leave from 6 weeks to 12 weeks, increased paternity leave by 4 days, expanding the child care hours on bases, and allowing service members the option to stay at their current station of choice for family reasons if they agree to serve an additional obligation. And why should we care so much about families? Well, because I think what we do to signal that we're a family-friendly force is absolutely essential to our future strength. And here's why, and Colonel Huggins also spoke to this. Our enlisted force, 52% married. Officer force, 70% married. Of those, we have 84,000 military-to-military families. So while we recruit a service member, we really retain a family, and that's important. So it's also my assertion that DoD must know what motivates potential recruits, what our military can do to improve their overall military experience, and how to retain them for when we need their skills the most. Force the Future initiatives attempt to address these underlying issues, and I truly applaud the effort. So last Thursday, you may have heard Secretary Carter testify to Congress on Force the Future, among other topics, and it was met by some very harsh criticism. But in the long run, I think this resistance to change, this resistance to dialogue, is going to cost us in the long run when it comes to recruiting and retaining our talent that we need to fight and win our future wars. So in conclusion, I don't know what's going to happen with Force of the Future specifically, but I encourage everyone to keep an open mind, keep the dialogue going, and to keep a weather eye on the future of our volunteer force.
Thank you very much. Weather eye has to be a Navy bias
It is.
there. Thank you so much. I think one of the marks of a healthy institution, like a healthy individual, is the ability to be self-critical. And Colonel Keaveney raises some fascinating issues about leaders capable of constructing strategies that either avoid conflict or, once committed, win decisively. And there's an interesting phrase that he's used, which is how to move the military beyond developing tactical masters, which can come at the expense of achieving strategic acumen. Leadership matters in every sphere, but especially in the military. And it's your task to take us through that.
Sure. First, thanks for having me here this morning. Great pleasure to sit up here and share this morning with you. If you think back to our opening comments from General Allen, he spent a good amount of time talking through his own self-development, how he developed personally and professionally over a period of years in such a way that it prepared him for his final leadership roles as a general officer in Iraq and Afghanistan. He specifically stated that the Corps at the time was not doing that for him. That was something he had to watch out for. And if you remember, Colonel Huggins, in one of his opening remarks, talked about the fact that we have not had an enduring strategic outcome from any of our conflicts over the last few decades. In fact, many, as they look back at the last half of the 20th century, find two where we had an enduring political outcome: World War II and Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And they attribute that primarily to the strategic leadership, the strategic decision-making, the strategic end states. The Army is a people business. We talk a lot about equipment, and we spend billions of dollars a year on equipment. But at the end of the day, the Army does not man equipment. The Army equips the soldier. And it is the soldier that brings about those enduring outcomes, from private at the tactical level to senior leader developing those strategic ends. And so that has been the focus of one of my projects throughout this fellowship year. And I'll give you some truth in lending. I have been doing this in conjunction with my colleague at the CFR, Colonel Mike Fenzel. Mike and I both commanded brigade combat teams at the same time. We were both division chiefs of staff, he in the 82nd, me in the 101st. Both Mike and I have a career-long passion for leader development. And so what better place for us to take some time and think about it? Now, most in this room, I'd imagine, have read senior scholars, academics, and even military leaders lament that we have built tactical and operational mastery, undeniably the best in the world, and some believe at the expense of that strategic acumen. As Mike and I look at that challenge, that accusation, we believe we have found a hole in our swing. And so I'll offer you this. As a cadet and a company grade officer, we will spend the better part of a decade teaching that officer to master the tactical realm. And we do it in a crawl, walk, run methodology. So I'll generalize. As a cadet, you're crawling, you're learning the basics. As a lieutenant, you're walking, you're putting those basics to practice. And as a captain, a company commander, you're now running, executing those tactical operations. As you transition to the field grade, you start that process over again at the operational level. You can't give up the tactical mastery, but now as a field grade, you start to get exposed to the operational world. As a lieutenant colonel, you master that. As a colonel, you refine that. And so we've got a very solid system writ large on how to develop tactical and operational masters, and that has shown itself in our operations over the last 20, 30 years. Here's where we face the challenge. At the strategic level, we will send lieutenant colonels and colonels to fellowships. We will send them to the war colleges, and we will expose them to the world of strategy. Philosophically, practically, we'll review strategic books, documents, strategic lectures, and then we'll send those lieutenant colonels and colonels out to the force as strategic leaders. Many would espouse, well, that's about right. So you start crawling strategically as a colonel and then develop that over time. But here's the issue. Colonels run our Army. Colonels interact with our national policy leaders. And both our senior Army leaders and our national policy leaders expect colonels to be running at the strategic level. And so we've got a gap. Some have espoused there's a silver bullet answer. And the silver bullet answer is, well, send them to grad school or send them to get a PhD. While that is certainly part of it, can be a part of the equation, the truth is there's no silver bullet. And so I'll give you a quote from General Colin Powell. And he states it's like calculus. And we, the officer corps, are the area under the curve. We are the product of all of our education, training, experiences, bosses good and bad. There is no silver bullet. With that as a foundation, our research and study leads us to believe that there are two components missing from officer development, or they are not formalized. The first is that there are a range of career paths that start developing officers earlier. Not new, but something that is slid to the side as we've all been focused on tactical and operational requirements over the last 15 years. The second is that there are formal adjustments that we need to make as an Army in our officer development path. So we've looked at history to identify, what are some of these options? What are some of the career paths that are out there? We've already talked about our strategic enduring outcomes came from World War II, and they came from Desert Shield, Desert Storm. That's the last half of the 20th century. There are literally dozens of examples we could use, so we limited ourselves to two in each war. In World War II, we went with Marshall and Eisenhower, and in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, we went with Schwarzkopf and Powell. Now, first, what I've got to say is there are some commonalities. They all had incredible integrity. They all had a feverish desire to develop themselves personally. They were all intellectually agile. They all tended not to lean towards groupthink. They possessed talent. And they all had an enormously broad, rich, and diverse background. So I'll just summarize a little bit of each. Marshall, we categorize Marshall as the teacher. Why? He served as an instructor multiple times throughout his career. Those instructor assignments were punctuated by assignments as an apprentice or an advisor to a senior leader. When he wasn't doing one of those two things, he was assigned to write doctrine, new emerging doctrine, create the new rules for employment of the tank in warfare. All of those assignments helped develop him over time, starting when he was a captain, to lead our Army through World War II, really our defense through World War II. Eisenhower's had similar experiences, but we title Eisenhower the organizer. Eisenhower was known for his public patience, his ability to organize just about anything, his unparalleled ability to form a coalition and lead very, very strong-willed personalities. That didn't happen overnight. When you look at Eisenhower's background, as a young officer, he asked to deploy to the Philippines. He was told no. Go to Texas. His first assignment as an officer in Texas, coach this football team. So his first assignment was taking a diverse array of very strong-willed players and forming them into a team. He then asked to deploy to World War I. He was told no, stay at home. So he stayed at home. His assignments included teaching, developing tank doctrine, a new and emerging capability, teaching that doctrine, and then he had several assignments where he was in support of senior leaders. Many of you know he was aide to MacArthur when MacArthur was the Chief of Staff of the Army, and then he went out to the Philippines and was a senior advisor to the Philippine government as a lieutenant colonel. He remained a major for 16 years, so a lot of exposure before he hit the rank of colonel. Fast forward to Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Schwarzkopf. We titled Schwarzkopf the commander. He had some similar experiences to the other two, but his really went back and forth to command more often. Schwarzkopf grew up abroad as a young guy. His father was in the Army. He traveled. He lived in Iran, Switzerland, Germany. He learned 3 languages, went off to school, earned his commission, had a lifelong love for the Middle East. did his time in service as a company grade, mastered the tactical level, went off, got a master's degree, then went to West Point to teach for 3 years. After his first year there, he volunteered to go to Vietnam. He went to Vietnam and advised a Vietnamese paratrooper battalion, where Schwarzkopf earned 2 Silver Stars and a Purple Heart. He then went back to teach at West Point. After he taught at West Point, he went back to Vietnam. So his teaching time surrounding his commands gave him time to reflect. And he, in his mind, formulated what he thought was wrong with our approach in Vietnam and what he thought would be right. And that shaped his perspective as he went off into the general officer and strategic ranks. Finally, General Powell. We call General Powell the communicator. Most, when they think of General Powell, automatically think of his time in the White House and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so they think that's where he became the strategic leader. When you ask General Powell, where did you get your most strategic thought? His most strategic thought came in the Command and General Staff College and in the War College. Why? Because he had time to think. And that's one of his laments, is that we spend so much time operating today that we don't provide the time to think. What's important to understand about General Powell is that he spent time as a White House fellow before the Command and General Staff College. And then, to use his quote, I had a series of weird assignments after brigade command that had me interact with people like Weinberger and Reagan and on and on and on and on. So again, punctuated opportunities to serve with civilian leadership, surrounded by opportunities to think with military leaders, gave him an incredible capability to communicate with civilian leadership. There are 4 opportunities. They interweave. They may have developed their own career path. What we find today is that more often than not, the experience is not part of a path, it is part of an officer volunteering, or it may be a one-time placement. We think there are adjustments required in our officer development. The first and foremost I want to highlight is we cannot, morally must not, take our focus off tactical mastery at the lieutenant and junior captain level. That would be criminal, because that is where we shed blood. Our tactical mastery enables operations and strategy. Without that tactical mastery, the strategy can quickly become meaningless. But after we've developed that tactical mastery at the captain level, we recommend an initial exposure to the strategic level. In CAS-Cube, an exposure to the philosophy of strategy, whether it's Thucydides or Clausewitz or discussions or a required reading. If you look at our required reading for captains today, it's all in the tactical realm. We Were Soldiers Once and Young, This Kind of War, phenomenal books about tactics. We need to expose them to strategy. At the field grade level, we need to take them to the walking capability at the strategic level. And so bring more of strategic exposure into the War College or into the Staff College. And then finally, at the Senior Service College, our captains should be running, or our colonels should be running at the strategic level.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am grateful, as you will see later, that you mentioned General Eisenhower, but you'll see that at the end. And now, Lieutenant Colonel Sundquist, we are more appreciative of and concerned about the reserves after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we've used them in ways that we really hadn't before. Colonel Sundquist, your work is on adapting the Army Reserve for the future. How do we make the idea of a total force work in what is and will be a fiscally constrained environment?
First, I'd like to thank you, like everyone else, for allowing me to come speak at the Brookings Institute. This is my first time on a panel, so be interesting, and don't tear me up too bad. But I'll keep my comments fairly short so that we can open up for questions and start the dialogue. To begin, if you really look at the historical framework of America and America's Army going back to its start as a country, the face of the military as a whole has predominantly always been that of the militias, or in the early 1900s, that of the incorporation of the reserves and the National Guards as we know them today. In the 70s after Vietnam, predominantly after Vietnam and the incorporation of the Abrams Doctrine, which led to the total force concept and then the total force policy, that paradigm shifted. And the face of the American military predominantly became that of the active force, with the assistance of the now National Guards and the reserve components that came along and helped support what the active force did. Within these three components, that held for a number of years. The issue that really you start seeing creeping in once this shifting happened to the all-volunteer force, as Colonel Huggins described, is twofold. Really, you started to have a disconnect between the population because the active force became the face of how America did its outreach internally and externally, whether it's domestic or international. And you started to have an issue with this, what we call mission creep within the military. Within this mission creep, because we have this force that's always there all the time and not something that we have to generate at a moment's notice if something goes down, we have the propensity to want to tag the military to do a number of operations continuously over a large spectrum, strategically, operationally, or tactically. For instance, in the last 15 to 20 years, you've seen the military not only do combat operations in war in multiple contingency operational environments from Afghanistan to Iraq, but you've also seen the military have to deal with domestic issues, whether it's Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, earthquakes, fire deployment for forest fires. You see them get deployed in issues that deal with nuclear meltdowns in Japan, whether it's whether it's humanitarian assistance operations abroad, name the country, all the way to Ebola virus counteracting with AFRICOM. The problem with what you see when this evolves over time is the complexity of the environment grows significantly. Now take that and combine it in an environment, as we have seen multiple times over the course of all of our lifetimes, where as we come out of major combat operations, we continuously want to pull back our military force. It's the American psyche. That's how we always operate. We always want a smaller force when we don't need them. Yet what's happening nationally, whether you look at the quadrennial report coming out of the military, the national strategic documents that come out of the White House and Congress, is what you want us to do as a military hasn't dissipated. In fact, it's actually grown. What you don't want us to do is spend more money as a military. So you fiscally constrain us over time, giving us the same amount of missions, if not more, in the same amount of time. This has created a problem. And my research, according to what I've tried to do at Georgetown, is address this problem. I started it out on the Afghanistan team with the Army Chief of Staff a couple years ago, and then the Army Commission came on board through congressional mandate to actually discuss and look at ways to fix this problem in a constricted environment fiscally, understanding that these requirements are not going to go away over time. How do we do this while we're also downsizing the active force? So what I've approached, and I'll put out here real quick, and then we can go to the questions, is I've attacked four main areas. I can't give all the answers. My research is very limited in its scope. But what the Army Commission did is they went through a number of different areas. I've tried to pick a couple that they identified, and then I've picked two that I don't think they really identified too much that may actually help. One of these issues is this integration. And overall, what I'm trying to do is integrate the components, whether it's the active force, whether it's the reserve, Army Reserves, or whether it's the National Guard. My take is that if you want to fiscally constrain the military, DOD as a whole, but you want to have the same strategic requirements placed on the military to perform these duties over time, you have to somehow integrate your component forces across all three components into one cohesive force. One of the ways that I put forth to do that is through what the Commission put out as a recommendation is what they call multi-component unit, MCUs. And this is a design of taking different units and actually aligning them in a multi-component environment. Case in point, you had the 48th Combat Service Hospital that was actually employed or deployed into combat in Afghanistan in 2003. Very first multi-component hospital, surgical hospital ever used in combat was a success. Was such a success that it's actually incorporated into the Army structure right down the road at Fort Meade now into a peacetime operational unit. So it exists, we've done it, it works, but what happens over time we have found is that the challenges that exist between the different components, whether it's cultural or structural, when we come out of combat, we tend to want to revert back to what we knew before, and we don't want to continue down these roads to integrate these forces across the spectrum so that we can operate effectively when we're needed. MCUs, I contend, would be that one of the biggest requirements that's put on reserve components as we start up in any kind of conflict is this train-up time. Everybody talks about the train-up time. Integration helps compress this train-up time so that we can get forces to where we need them as quickly as we can get them there to support the active force. What we tend to do when we come out of combat is we tend to expand this back out because we tend to go back into our lanes of what we call strategic forces and active forces, and we don't do the things that we were doing under the auspices of combat activity. I posit that MCUs or multi-component units will actually help us keep ourselves aligned both operationally and strategically from a military perspective on a long-term basis so that we can mitigate these effects when these forces are called upon during any kind of incident. It could be domestic or international. One other way that it was put forth in the commission report that I advocate is to help this MCU development, you have to have what they call Title 11 funding. We have an AGR system that works within the National Guard and the U.S. Army Reserves. And over time, this AGR system has kind of been shrunk, whether it's congressional mandate, funding, whatever it may be. It's essentially shrunk in size, yet the requirements exist for these units and these full-time personnel to actually conduct business with these units across the board. That requirement hasn't gone away. Title 11 funding can help offset that. Increasing this funding from a congressional perspective can help offset that. What Title 11 funding does is it gives the reserve components full-time active duty support within their formations to help that connectivity between those two components. It's very limited right now, but over time, if you increase the funding for this stuff, it will actually help mitigate the effects of the lack of AGR support that you see over a long-term basis and help connect this tissue, if you want to call it that, between these integrated concepts. And I can go into that more later. Some of the other two items that the commission report, the first one they hit on a little bit, but they didn't really, which I found interesting, they didn't go into discussions about it. Recommendation number 27 discussed an idea of integrated billets. I actually termed this in my research multi-component billet structures. And the way I laid it out is that going beyond just MCU, this multi-component unit support, I advocate that we need to go the step farther and actually integrate down to the individual level within the units. And I include this to also include brigade combat teams. If you look at the broad spectrum of what these BCTs, these brigade combat teams, take into combat, they have logistical, medical, intelligence support across the spectrum to make that fighting unit integrated. If you want to have an integrated force in a fiscally constrained environment that can meet the requirements that are placed upon it at the strategic level, you have to be able to maintain this connective tissue from whether it's educational, operational, strategic, whatever level you're looking at has to be maintained at that individual to unit structure. And as some of my counterparts have talked about, we have gaps in these different structures. A lot of these gaps are created because when we come out of combat environments, we go back to what we know before that environment happened, whether it's because money isn't there or whether we just don't have the time or we don't have the people. So if you can keep these linkages connected over time at the individual level through a multi-component billet structure, you can help mitigate some of these effects that we see. And in the research that I did with the OEF team with the CSA, we see this over time as one of the problems when we start introducing reserve components into the active force structure in combat zones or in domestic incidents that pop up. This disparity between knowledge and operational understanding of the picture. My hope is that multi-component billets will help mitigate this problem over time. Finally, one thing that the Commission report didn't talk about was if we are going to continue down the road in the foreseeable future of pulling back our financial framework on the military, while we're still enhancing the complexity and requirements at the strategic and operational level, we need to seriously look at, from the Army Reserve's perspective, of a tiered readiness environment. We've done it before. The military on the active side in the fiscal year 2015 budget has introduced it. It's the only plausible way under fiscal constraints that you can ensure that you have certain A-level units, if you want to call them A-level units or level 1 readiness units, that you can ensure are both fiscally maintained, manpower maintained, and equipment maintained to the level that the active force requires in any kind of short notice situation. One thing that I have found in my research is that what gives the military the hardest problem out of anything is no notice, very short events that hit us that we have to react to very quickly. And what that causes when we react to it, if we get into a cycle of what we saw in the last 14 years of this cyclical cycle of deployments, that will eventually break the force. It happened to us in 2003. It's the only time in our nation's history that we've come up, bumped up against that window to where we were going to break the force. So we have to look at this paradigm shift of what's going on, and we have to address it. We're at an inflection point, and I told the staff earlier, we're at an inflection point right now in our nation's history. We've tried to do this integration in the past through different techniques, and we always seem to walk away from it for whatever reasons. Somebody doesn't want to do it. If we don't do it now, we're going to have a force that physically cannot meet the requirements that this nation wants, and that's a problem. If you want to connect the tissue to the American public, your reserve components are your American public. They sit in all the states. They sit in all the little municipalities and all the cities. They're there. They're your face. If you want to connect, that's one piece where you can bridge this gap, this signal gap that is created over time. So there are challenges, and I'll discuss those. Some of the challenges are structural within our environment, and some of the challenges, big challenges, are cultural within our environment. And I can give you some examples of that personally if we want to discuss that. But I'll wrap it up so we can do the questions.
Thank you so much. I wish we had about an hour and a half more on this panel. And I think what I'd like to do, because I want to bring the audience in right away, I'm sort of left with three big thoughts myself, among, I mean, more than that, but a series of questions that I just like to put on the table, and you can answer them or not as you go about answering other questions. The first is, again, I really appreciate your candor, Colonel Huggins, about the various who is in and who is not in. My sister had a neighbor who was a career Navy officer, and he and I loved to argue about politics. And he often began the conversation by saying, look, I understand, I grew up in I've worked in a socialist institution. My healthcare is paid for, my housing is paid for, and I have loved it. And then he proceeded to argue as a conservative, and I loved his candor, but there is a paradox that he points to here. And I accept and respect the fact that military folks understand, are very conscious of civilian rule. But this gets to the second point that goes to strategy and tactics, which is so many of our wars, all wars are political in some sense, war is politics by other means. But when you look back at the wars we most succeeded at, they were the ones that had the least complex politics to them in a way. The objective in World War II was total victory. The objective in Desert Storm was remove Saddam's forces from Kuwait. Almost all the other wars we've been involved in since World War II were much more complicated and political. And so I think the interaction of politics, strategy, and approach to war is actually a really critical question as we think about it, which leads to what Lieutenant Commander Jacobson was talking about, which is, as Colonel Huggins said, there are some very clear bulges in our military in terms of who is in and who is not in. And if you could keep in the back of your head, is the job of recruitment to try to do something about that? Do we need different kinds of people in the military as well as the very effective kinds we've already had? So I'm just going to put those on the table as questions that, among the many questions that your great presentations brought to mind. And I want to turn to the audience. And there is a mic going around. I always say no one likes to ask the first question. I've already asked 3, so think of this as the 4th question. In the back there, sir, on the left.
Yeah, Ken Meyercord, WorldOx. One of the big changes in our military force over the last decade or two has been the increased integration of what most unkindly can be termed mercenaries in our military campaigns. How has that affected the all-volunteer force?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the question. The issue of contractors on the battlefield and where their authorities end, how they affect the psyche, how they affect this bond. I think an even more transactional relationship exists between some of the contracted forces, and they provide all sorts of services, logistics to actual security. Far more transactional. What you see is these folks who are indispensable to the effort, the way we have chosen to fight our wars, are not covered post-war. They're not part of the discussion for PTSD. They're not part of the discussion for trash dump burning and attendant lung issues and those sorts of things. I do think it kind of gets at the basic social contract between the nation and its military. It does introduce issues like you saw in feudal Italy, where you turn your security over to mercenary forces and weaken that bond between the citizen and the defense of its republic. And so I recognize that. I think, frankly, the economics is what drove it. I think that's fairly obvious. The chance to hire a service for a limited duration without committing to a lifetime of support for the guys who provided that service is compelling. Do I think it's destructive? Barry Huggins, personally speaking, philosophically, yeah, I do. I think those kinds of services where you contract people in a completely and transparently transactional relationship to provide services that could, in fact, include committing violence on behalf of the American people is destructive to the social contract. The people that do violence in the name of the American people ought to have a different relationship to those people, I think, than a merely fiscal one.
Thank you. In the back there, right near.
Thank you for an outstanding program. Thomas Switzer from State Department. And I want to direct a question at image enhancement for recruitment purposes. Talking to DoD recruiters over the years, many of whom are close friends and colleagues, 2 films seem to have stood out. Top Gun, way back in the 70s, with Tom Cruise, and American Sniper, just last year, in which both films, and I'm sure there are numerous others of that genre, emphasize the dedication, the sacrifice, both personal and family, and the courage of frontline troops. And the question is about if we are to reach out more effectively to this younger generation, high school, college age, should we be doing more? Should DoD and its partners be doing more along this lines of films and even consideration of more TV series along that line? Trying to avoid the excesses of Hollywood, but enhancing our image, by the way. Thank you.
Why don't you take that, Lieutenant Commander Jacobson? He's trying to send you to Hollywood, which I think would be kind of fun.
Yeah, that would be fun. So I don't know much about the Hollywood world, but to speak to recruiters, and this goes to your question, I don't think it's a recruiter's job. It's not within their job scope to narrow what the services need. So I'm speaking from my Navy experience here, but recruiters are all about numbers, right? So if they can get the fit to fill ratio right, that's wonderful. But they're more concerned about getting butts in seats. So I think it's really up to the services to kind of manage that internally. And there are efforts within the Navy, and I'm a part of one of those efforts in my community, surface warfare, where we are going out through social media. We have a variety of initiatives to attract and retain the folks that we want. The talent that is, we're targeting talent, vice the most willing. And that, I think, is very service specific. And in fact, you know, even within the Navy, it's very specific to our different communities. So you know, you're right. Top Gun, huge seller. That was probably the best recruiting for aviation that you know, could have occurred. Battleship was not so much a success. I think that might have gone the other way for the Navy. But anyway, so yeah, recruiting, I think it really needs to go down at the service level and tailored.
Yeah, the question of outreach is tricky. I do applaud the Navy officer and gentleman as well was a good one that inspired me. But the Navy seems to, all of these are Navy pictures. I'm not sure why. More photogenic, I suppose. I would point out that JAG, which was also a Navy television show, was offered to the Army. We turned it down. It then spawned NCIS and the various NCISs, another opportunity missed. I just don't know how it translates. I don't know if you could make the link. I think probably Top Gun is widely understood to have had an impact. The Army's efforts that I'm familiar with, sponsorship of NASCAR teams and so forth, mostly open us up to ridicule. And senators who are, you know, competing for, they're allocating 50% of the discretionary budget, and they're wondering why we're spending it in those kinds of things. Well, I mean, that's the Army's perspective. That's where Southern football playing, NASCAR racing kids, you know, that's where we went. Maybe we do need to target outside our comfort zone.
Could I ask, that's a great question, because when you think about movies and the portrayal of the military, there are a lot of kind of Lone Ranger, sniper, one courageous hero movies. There are also a lot of great anti-war movies. There are very few movies that I can think of, maybe The Monuments Men, which was fascinating portrayal of the military's complicated role, but there are very few that get at the complexity of what serving is all about. I'm curious, any of your thoughts, since you must be consumers of movies of this sort.
I think it's far less cinematic to show the hours and hours of intense boredom, the spades games, the pranks, the, you know, whatever that kind of go on when young men gather. It might not be the image we wish to push. It's just the reality of life, and so.
No, but I mean, in terms of what really the complicated decisions leaders make. I mean, there are a lot of dramatic decisions that are complicated and that are moral choices, and the notion of military leaders who are conscious of making moral choices and that sort of thing. We don't really, I mean, you get that sometimes in the Lone Ranger sort of movie, but you don't, I don't think you get an appreciation of that side of what you folks do. I don't know, I'm curious. You had a smile on your face that made me want you to speak.
Well, so, I mean, specifically for the ground forces, there are movies out there that try to depict what happens at the tip of the spear. We Were Soldiers Once and Young, Saving Private Ryan, and going Platoon. I mean, there's a bunch like that. The challenge is, while you tell the soldier's story, you're telling a story that even soldiers don't like when it's occurring. It is not natural to go into human-to-human combat, and it is not clean and it is not pretty. It is a story that needs to be told because we do have young Americans that will go do that for us. But I don't know that that helps with recruiting. All it does is it helps the American population understand these great young people that will go into harm's way on our behalf.
In the back there, please, with the glasses.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. Again, Thomas Labouche, French liaison officer at the Pentagon. If I may just stand back but stick to this problematic of recruiting, I think that Secretary Carter told yesterday in the conference press at the Pentagon that attract and retain the main power was a huge challenge to come. So my question would be, what would be the best way to attract and retain the youth power? Is it by marketing what is common between the military opportunities and the civil jobs or way of life? or by placing the emphasis on what makes military different: adventure, team spirit, but also toughness and potentially sacrifice? And second question, if I may, to Colonel Kiveny, maybe. I'm not sure who said that, if it's General von Moltke or General Eisenhower, but one of those said, the plan is the first casualty in war. So where do you see concrete measures to improve how the US should train their leaders to lead efficiently in the fog of war? Thanks.
Well, I can go after the second one right away. It was General Eisenhower. And it's been quoted many different ways, but essentially a plan doesn't survive first contact. It's not about the plan, it's about the planning. And when you look at Eisenhower's development over time and his ability to build a coalition and handle strong personalities, that is strategic acumen. You asked the question, what is strategy? Good strategy explains in crystal clear terms what the desired outcomes are, what we are going to commit to achieve those outcomes, and how we are going to achieve those outcomes. So we talk about complexity. Some would argue that World War II was no less complex. Some would argue that Desert Storm was no less complex. Their assertion would be that we determined a political outcome. This will be the end state, and we are willing to commit the ways and the means to accomplish that political outcome. What becomes important for strategic military leaders is the ability to have a dialogue, a clear, understandable dialogue with civilian leadership. And that's a two-way street. So I would challenge anybody that's interested to look at the civilian strategic leader development model. But it's got to be a dialogue, and military leaders provide best military advice how to achieve an objective. Now, old school think says the civilian gives the objective and the military develops the plan to achieve it. The truth of the matter is you need a range of outcomes. And so the military leader has involvement in the range of outcomes and therefore the range of possibilities, ways and means to achieve that range of outcomes. That takes lifelong study and development so that you can come up with a plan, knowing that you'll shift, and then you need to be agile enough to shift.
By the way, I think that also underscores a problem the Colonel raised about the decline in the number of political leaders with military experience, because that's a very interactive process you're talking about. Sir?
To kind of piggyback off the question on some recruitment and retention issues, one interesting dynamic after Vietnam, and the older crowd can probably notice this more than I did, but there was a huge backlash towards the military within the academic environment, to the point that a large portion, and I'll split it between North and South, I guess, that's probably not the correct political way to say it, but the northern schools, the academic environments, pulled a lot of their ROTC programs out of their academic environment. Some of them have since kind of reintroduced, some of them kind of play with it, where they have a central structure for 4 or 5 schools, but it's not as predominant as you see it in the southern universities. You also see this at the high school level with the JROTC program, and I would contend that if you really want to put a face, this connection to develop recruitment before the recruiters pick them up, that you have to make that connection at an early age in an individual's life, his or her life. And that could possibly be in the JROTC program. It could be in the ROTC program. And I'll give you a case in point at Georgetown. They have the Hoya battalion there, but I've been there for almost a year, and I've yet to see any of these individuals anywhere on campus in uniform, or I don't even know who they are. I don't even know, I kind of think I know where they're at, but I've never been there to see where their offices are at. Now, that's a problem. It's like you want to have the environment there, the connection to the military, but you don't want to show it in public, which I think is a problem. Because one of the perceptions that I've noticed over my career is that for whatever reason, the military and their officers and their enlisted are never viewed as intellectually smart. But when you look at the background of most military officers or and some enlisted, higher enlisted, they have immense degrees across a wide spectrum of knowledge. But that's not put out there, and that challenge, even at the high school level, is not demonstrated to the kids in school, to where they view the military avenue is, oh my God, these guys are like really smart, and this is the way to go, because I want to be connected to that. And I think if you really want to start, Hollywood's great, but look, I haven't watched a war movie since I've been back from combat. I can't sit down and watch it. I applaud anybody that can go through it, but half of it's not realistic in my mind, and I don't really want to look at it again. But the kids at the lower educational levels are the most inspirational and look at their future in that prism at that level. And that's where you need to get these guys and girls' attention and show them that, military, if that's the avenue they want to look at, that you don't go in there just because your parents are poor and you don't have any other avenue. You go there because these guys are sharp, these girls are sharp, and they're going to be future leaders of the country. And they have opportunities just like civilian world has. I mean, the civilian companies hire military JMOs, junior military officers, for a reason. And it's not because they're dumb. It's because they have a wide breadth of knowledge and understanding of how to deal with issues in a very complex world. So I would gather go in that range.
Yeah, you laid out two alternatives for how we position ourselves. One is the kind of the career, the way of life. The other is the seeking for adventure. I think because we are kind of impermeable, and this is one of the challenges that Katie and the Force of the Future effort face, because we're impermeable, our career model is we access and recruit, and then we develop. We don't transition back and forth often, at least not in the uniform side. And so I think there's two approaches. I think the initial approach, the initial hook is this adventure and so forth. But then, because you retain families, the career and the way of life becomes more important in speaking to your own internal audience. Katie?
Yeah, that's right.
I am afraid we've got to stop. In fact, we're over time. I want to someday, while you're still around, Colonel, I'd like us to do something on the idea of national service, because I do think that has the promise of at least breaking down some of these barriers, even if I think compulsory national service is unlikely to happen. But there are models for much broader kinds of service to the country that could include a lot more people. I mentioned that I was happy that Lieutenant Colonel Sundquist mentioned Eisenhower, and Ike is one of my heroes in American history, and so I collect Eisenhower quotes, and one of my favorites is, "You don't lead by hitting people over the head. That's assault, not leadership." I think that's a useful lesson in the political sphere, in other spheres, and it's an honor to moderate a panel where every member understands Ike's lesson. Thank you all so very much.